Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. This episode is a reading, Mandala and Āgamic Identity by Alexis Sanderson, Part 2. This is an abridgment of the article in question. If you find it interesting, you could read the full article. The meditator then sees these same powers, precognitive impulse, cognition, and action, Icha, Jnana, Kriya, rising up in the urge to enter the undifferentiated heart of consciousness, to abandon their mutual difference in their final expansion as the non-dual ground. It is in this ultimate thrust of resorption that they manifest themselves as the deities enthroned on the lotuses in the Mandala, revealing in this configuration of convergence the worshipper's innermost identity as the fourth power hidden in their center. Worship is the emergence of this fourth power in consciousness as the convergence of the triad. This point of rest in the pure autonomy of the self, this innermost identity within para, para, and apara, which finally resorbs the distinction between power and I as the holder of power, between the worshipped and the worshipper, is the goddess Kālī, the destroyer of time, Kāla Sankarshani. Now, this deity is completely absent in the texts of the earliest stratum of the Trika, among which must be placed the Malini Vijayottara Tantra. Of that work, Abhinavagupta says in the preface to his Tantra Loka, "There is nothing in my text which has not been taught by the God of gods in the Malini Vijayottara, either explicitly or by implication." Finding Kālī in the core of the liturgy of this Tantra, Abhinavagupta infuses into it the power of the northwestern Kālī cults, whose claim to be the most radical of Shaiva soteriologies was gaining recognition in esoteric circles. To achieve this blatant overcoding, he was not obliged to expose himself or his gurus to the charge of originality. For if the Malini Vijayottara Tantra was unaffected by the esotericism of the Kālī cult, there were other āgamas of the Trika which had already sanctified this radical reorientation. Thus, the meditation on the upward expansion of the three powers to their fusion in the self as Kālī, Kāla Sankarshani, with which Abhinavagupta inspires the internal installation of the Malini's Mandala throne, is recorded by him as his teacher Shambhunatha's interpretation of the Devya Yamala Tantra, an āgama of the Trika which proclaims its allegiance to the Kālī cult by enthroning Kāla Sankarshani above the three goddesses as the fourth power containing and transcending the three. Abhinavagupta overcodes the liturgy of the Malini Vijayottara Tantra by identifying the Devyayamala's Kala Sankarshani with the Malini's deity Matrasadbhava, the form in which Para is to be worshipped on the central lotus of the internal mandala. This Matrasadbhava, essence of the mother goddesses, but interpreted by Abhinavagupta's tradition as essence of all knowers, is for the Malini itself no more than another mantra form of the goddess Para. For Abhinavagupta, it has become the transcendental, all-englobing fourth power in which the Trika Shaiva's identity is raised from the outer and earlier level of the cult to Kālī in its core. I'll just add a note here that in academic literature such as this, the term cult is being used neutrally, not with the pejorative connotations it has in modern mainstream culture. The empowerment of the Trika by the cult of Kālī does not end with the superimposition of Kala Sankarshani onto the Malini Vijayottara Tantra's internal mandala. This simple Kāīi-based triad of the Devyayamala Tantra can be seen as a bridge, both in the history of the sect and in Abhinavagupta's exegesis, between the earlier Kālī-less stratum and one in which the Trika has incorporated the more elaborate Kālī system known as the Krama. This Krama, also known as the Great Truth, Mahartha, or the Great Doctrine, Mahanaya, teaches liturgies in which Kālī, as the all-devouring power of consciousness, is realized through her worship in a series of cycles of deities embodying the transformations of her powers in the cyclical sequence of cognition, from its projection of the object to its resorption into internal quiescence. In the center is Mahakali, equated with the world-manifesting vibration, spanda, within the heart of consciousness and bliss, realized when the meditator dissolves into the egoless ground through the contemplation that the agent, act, and object of cognition are consciousness in essence, visualized as the awesome black goddess haloed in the fire of her own radiance. The innermost power of the mandala of final initiation into the Trika is then this quintessential deity group of the Krama, Kala Sankarshani, mirrored in the 12 Kālīs of the nameless, Anakya Chakra, as all-pervading, all-devouring non-duality in the dynamic cycle of the object, act, and agent of cognition. Now, just as this 12-fold sequence of the nameless, Anakya Krama, or Kālī Krama, opens up from within the convergence of the three Trika goddesses in the initiation mandala, so it is deployed in the practices of meditation that seek to realize this āgamic identity through controlled possession, also known as immersion, subsequent to initiation. Yet just as the presence of the awesome 12 Kālīs in the mandala is nowhere explicitly stated in the Tantra Loka, being perceptible only through the collation of scattered remarks in the light of the commentary and the āgamic literature known to the author, so here the pervasion of soteriological practice by this cycle is conveyed by widely separated passages and in deliberately oblique terms. Abhinavagupta states the principle behind his treatment of this level of the Trika at the conclusion of the chapter in which he summarizes the circuits of deities worshipped in the Mandala. Quote, while para, para, and apara are projection, immersion, and resorption, the fourth power, matrasadbhava, is defined as the ground in which they rest in unity, vishranti. This fourth is secret. It can be learnt only through oral instruction. Nonetheless, I have alluded to it here and there throughout the work. Unquote. Even in the fourth chapter of Tantraloka, in which he defines the experiential nature of each of the 12 Kālis, and in the Krama Stotra, which he devotes exclusively to this topic, he carefully avoids mentioning their names. We are told at the end of the passage that the power manifest as these 12 is indeed that called Kālī, Kālasankarshani. But the names of her reflected aspects are conveyed by him analytically, through the derivation of the Kāli which forms the second part of their names, out of the verbal root kal, which can mean to project, to go, to know, to enumerate, or to resonate. Thus, for example, Srishti Kāli, the first of the 12 Kālis, is covered as follows, quote, and therefore this radiant goddess, unsullied in her source, yet at the same time assuming the urge to manifest objectivity as though other than herself, ideates projection or emanation. Srishtim kalayate. Hence her name in the āgama. Unquote. Elsewhere, he disguises the Kālis of the secret fourth power yet further by translating them into the product of the multiplication of the three nameable, less awesome goddesses of the Trika base by the four abstract Krama categories behind the names and visualized forms of the hidden cult. Thus, in the first verse after his introduction to the Tantraloka, he announces that the principal cycle of powers in the Trika is 12-fold. The four phases, projection, immersion, resorption, and the nameless fourth, in para, and apara. That Jayaratha, in his comment on this verse, is right in saying that Abhinavagupta is really talking about the 12 Kālis here is evident if this statement is collated with others. Thus, in the fourth chapter, Abhinavagupta equates these Kālis with projection, immersion, resorption, and the fourth within the object, medium, and agent of cognition. While in the second verse of the work, he equates these three aspects of cognition with para, and apara. In his Tantrasara, we find a slightly different scheme. The 12 Kālis become projection, immersion, and resorption in the three goddesses and their ground, matrasadbhava. But this 3 times 4 is equivalent to the preceding 4 times 3 that we see in the Tantraloka, since matrasadbhava and the fourth phase are identical. Clearly, then, Abhinavagupta has set up equivalences by means of which the power of the Kāli cycle can be mediated through his exegesis of the Trika so that the esoteric āgamic identity is preserved from profanation through direct exposure, while at the same time he demonstrates the unity of the two levels. However, Abhinavagupta's concern to veil the 12 Kālis must also be seen in the context of the bond between esoteric power and public impurity. To rise through the grades of revelation from the Siddhanta to the Kālī cult was to gain access to power at the cost of ever-increasing impurity in the terms of the Orthodox consensus. The intensification of power is expressed in the language of ritual as the gradual emergence and eventual autonomy of Shiva's consort, Devi or Shakti. In the Siddhanta, this feminine essence is suppressed to the extent that in daily ritual only the male polarity is worshipped, the mild and consortless Sadashiva. In the Bhairava teachings, represented by the cult of Swachanda, Shiva transcends this mild form and is joined in worship by his consort in the form of Aghoreshwari. Nonetheless, at this level, Bhairava is still dominant. In the Trika, however, this relation is reversed. The three goddesses are enthroned above their Bhairavas as the principal recipients of worship. Finally, in the Krama, the goddess alone remains. She is no longer Shiva's consort, but pure power behind and manifesting the dichotomy between power and the controller of power, between goddess consort and god. This unleashing of the feminine from the control of the male is also the unleashing of impurity from the perspective of the Orthodox consensus. To move from the Siddhanta into the Bhairava teachings is, from the point of view of the former, to abandon the purity of Orthodox Veda-congruent discipline. But from the point of view of the latter, it is to transcend the petty extrinsicism of a purity-bound powerlessness into an ecstatic self-expansion in which all that the unenlightened consider impure is realized and exploited as the means with which to break through this powerlessness into omnipotence and omniscience. With the Krama sect of Kālī, this cult of impurity reaches its greatest intensity. Its āgamic literature shows the unleashed feminine presiding over a subculture in which skull-carrying devotees invoke her terrible power into themselves through sanguinary and orgiastic worship in the cremation grounds. Abhinavagupta most certainly gives the fullest recognition to this power of the impure, for it is a cardinal tenet of his soteriology that nothing is in itself charged with purity or impurity. To be unaware of this is the foundation of the heart's consent to the requirements of orthodox life, and access to the self's innate power requires that one abandon it. Liberation is through letting go of this extrinsicist inhibition, and Abhinavagupta recognizes that the ritual consumption of substances forbidden to the Orthodox is an effective means to this end. However, the domain of impurity in this context has two aspects, the erotic and the mortuary. Abhinavagupta emphasizes the former and suppresses the latter. In so doing, he deflects his āgamic identity away from the grimmer side of the culture associated with Kālī. addressing himself primarily to an audience of Shaiva householders, he speaks of power in the private domain of the erotic, rather than in that of public impurity courted by the exotic ascetics of the cremation grounds. His exegesis of the radical agamic inheritance aspires to a new Catholicity, that is, universality, within the Shaiva tradition. Transcendence of lower sect levels could achieve this in theory through the principle that the transcender contains the transcended, so that the highest is the all-containing. And we have seen this theory built into Trika ritual. It could not, however, bring this conviction of power down from its heterodox heights to penetrate the awareness of the Shaiva majority, whose life in the world necessitated a greater degree of conformity to orthodox norms of conduct and self-reference. To root itself in this more public level, while preserving its private hierarchy of ascent to heterodox power in its inner agamic identity, the Trika enriched its hermeneutical base with the recognition doctrine, the pratyabhijñā. Though this emerged with Somananda and Utpaladeva from within the Krama-based Trika tradition of the Theravada seminary in Kashmir, it formulated a metaphysics of the self within the conventions of high Brahminical learning. Thus, it succeeded in elevating itself above its widely suspect background, so that it could be deployed in a relatively sect-neutral exegesis over a much greater range of the Shaiva tradition. In fact, Utpaladeva's Universalist aspirations extended even further. He claimed to be making explicit the common truth latent in the dualism of the Siddhanta and the monistic emanationism of the Pancharatrika Vaishnavas and the illusionism of the Vedantins, and finally the consciousness-only doctrine of the Yogacara Buddhists as well. The doctrine of recognition did succeed in influencing the Pancharatra and the Vedanta in Kashmir. Now, this universalist self-presentation of the Trika in the third phase of its development doubtless accounts for the veiled manner in which Abhinavagupta handles its most conspicuously heterodox constituent, the cycle of the 12 Kālis. But this is not the limit of its effect. The new universalism affects the ritual of the Mandala itself by overcoding the internal installation of the Mandala throne in the one element free from the inertia of ritual forms, the inner yogic posture, through which this structure of mantras and visualizations is taken into the worshipper's identity. This sequence of meditation, described above in Part 1, is designed precisely to fuse together the two extremes of the third phase of the Trika's exegetical range, those extremes being the Siddhanta and the Krama. Thus, in one direction, the three goddesses of the Trika are raised to the worshipper's hidden identity with Kālī, while in the other, these Kāīi-based powers are seen to express themselves as the Malini Vijayottara Tantra's 7 levels of the agent of cognition, also known as the 7 perceivers, detailed in Chapter 3 of the Recognition Sutras, and hence to reach out into the Siddhanta's range of reference, for the 7 perceivers were originally a Siddhantika doctrine. At the same time, by incorporating these 7 levels, the meditation inculcates belief that the Trika subsumes the entire universe of self-reference, from the lowest level, which houses the unreflective subjectivity of the worldly, through the intermediate levels, which house the ideal selves of other systems. While those selves exclude and condemn the āgamic identity of the Trika Shaiva, the Trika Shaiva himself develops the liberating insight that these levels exist only as modalities of the dynamic non-duality of the divine word to which he accedes through initiation. Being modalities of this āgamic self, they cannot impede the range of his self-presentation. He can cultivate conviction of absolute power in the private domain of his ritual and reflection, while he shows to the world a perfect conformity to the requirements of purity. So just a little afterword. If this material seems difficult, well, my abridged version of the article is much easier to comprehend than the full article itself. Sanderson's writing is very dense, and that derives from many years spent immersing himself in the primary sources. But reflecting on what's said in these seminal articles, that is, Purity and Power Among the Brahmins of Kashmir and Mandala and Āgamic Identity, you can gain a deeper understanding of that which is explained in simpler language in my book, Tantra Illuminated.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.